Hi, my name is Adam Arellano. I am a field CTO at Harness, and I'm glad to be part of TechNadoo's Humans in Cyber video interview series. I've been asked to speak to you today on what is going to be happening at the end of 2025 with vibe coding, what's going to be coming in the new year, and talk more about what we do as cybersecurity people who interact with developers. So, to get started, a little bit of background about me. I started my career in the Marine Corps as a jet mechanic, turned into a cybersecurity officer, left and went to several different companies to become both a compliance and a cybersecurity expert and then leader, and also have led several engineering teams along the way. So the first question that I want to address is, in 2025 is the year AI took over coding. How did vibe coding take off, and where does it create new cyber risk for companies? So to start with, vibe coding, the big word or the big phrase that's been thrown around with generative AI this year when it comes to developers and engineering at different companies. Vibe coding is somewhat of a bad word in a lot of circles. For me, it's much less of a bad word and more of a tool like any other that can have good uses and bad uses. So there are a lot of people, executives, leaders, people who have never been developers, who've never had any kind of skill in coding, who've been able to use generative AI to actually build out functions, small programs, and other things like that, that help them with their daily tasks or help them accomplish something that they've been trying to accomplish, but would normally have had to involve another person to be able to do so. So a lot of people like that have turned to vibe coding to actually help their day-to-day or produce something that otherwise would have been very difficult. And in that sense, those micro projects or those small things that have been accomplished are great ways for people who aren't necessarily dyed-in-the-wool developers to get technology automation done. When it comes to actual developers or people who actually have software development experience, I think vibe coding is something that's been used to help them move more quickly through tasks or through the development of a program, or even some of the other tasks around development to produce code more quickly and to get more work done in a shorter amount of time. Does this create new cyber risk? I don't know that it creates new cyber risk. I think it might create more cyber risk. If you think about where the generative AI vibe coding type help comes from, all of these models have been trained on volumes and volumes of code that's been written over the last 20 years, pulled from any source available, which usually means that it's been pulled from open source coding. Now, if you look at the world of open source, it's not very consistent. You have some open source projects which are highly efficient, highly well respected. They're very, very well written pieces of code that some of the generative AI, some of the generative coding platforms have been trained on. There's also a lot of open source projects that are not well written. So the quality of the training data that these generative code assistants have been trained on is variable, but generally, in my opinion, is superior in a lot of ways to what some companies are doing internally. So it's possible that the quality of the code coming out of these vibe coding pipelines is actually slightly better, if not more verbose. I think the real issue isn't necessarily with cyber risk that's being introduced. I think it's with the volume at which this code is being produced. So if you have a pipeline that today or 2 months ago was already slower than the developer's ability to code. So in other words, if a developer had to wait for different steps in the process to get their code to production, having those developers create or produce twice as much code is not going to magically fix that pipeline and make it work more quickly. And I think that in and of itself might create an increase of risk, but it's still the same risk that security teams and companies and engineering teams in general haven't been able to keep up with the testing, the vetting of the code, the security reviews, and all the other things that need to happen to be able to get code in production. Those already underwater processes are going to be further underwater. And so the next thing that we want to talk about is how is vibe coding already showing up in enterprise workflows? What early safeguards or governance models can make this integration secure? So the initial vibe coding and enterprise workflows was probably happening on the side. There were a lot of enterprises that were very skittish about bringing in these vibe coding agents or these code assistants. And so what engineers were doing was using some kind of sidecar to be able to get help from generative code assistants and then bringing it into the pipeline as it was already. Since then, I think what's happened is most of the big players, whether it be Microsoft use it through GitHub or some of the native agents or the native enterprise generative AI agents that are now embedded in enterprises everywhere, everybody's come up with some kind of coding assistant. And so these enterprise workflows have now been given or injected with generative coding assistants kind of across the board. So they're almost everywhere. The safeguards and governance models that help us keep this integration secure actually exist mostly in the providers. So these providers have promised or tried to build in safeguards that have helped the source code of any particular company not go back into the training data and help them, in theory, keep the coding processes and the code that's being developed within the bounds of the actual environment that these enterprises are working inside. Whether or not that's effective, I'm not sure. I think what normally happens with technologies like this is that there are more mistakes made more quickly up front that then inform later safeguards and governance models. So I think we're still in that space where we don't have a good handle on all the different ways this could go wrong. And so the safeguards and governance models are in their infancy right now. And the more that we see these used, the better we're going to be able to kind of move forward and create better governance. What we would like to see is just more automation in the pipeline, more automation of processes that will check and make sure that the code is, free of secrets, that it's being appropriately vetted, that it's going through the right testing models and going through the right, linting and chaos and things like that. That's what we would want. We would want companies and enterprises to implement. Let's see. With AI tools now accessible to everyone, are you seeing more young or student hackers experimenting with generated code? And what risks does that introduce? So with AI tools kind of being ubiquitous, the question centers around, are there more young or student hackers experimenting with generated code? And what risks does that introduce? So the easy answer to this is yes. There are a ton of young people, and I think young is probably the wrong term. I think inexperienced is the right term because it doesn't necessarily bound itself to the age of a person. It's more easily tied to how much experience a person does or doesn't have in actual development, software development. So definitely I'm seeing a lot more people experimenting with generated code. Is that a good thing? Does it introduce risk? Yes, it introduces risk. But as I said before, it introduces a risk of the volume of code being produced as opposed to the actual risk of the kind of code being produced. Where I think it's been fascinating is to watch younger or less experienced adversaries actually getting in on the game by using generated code. That introduces new risk in the sense that where there was a technical barrier to some adversarial actors on the internet or actors in the technology space, there was a skills gap where they couldn't actually do much because they didn't have the software engineering or IT experience to be able to carry out some attacks that were available. With the advent of generated code, that is less of a barrier to entry. And adversaries are able to offer as a service or for a price a much more easily executable attack against different enterprises or different systems. So I think it's definitely introducing a volume of attacks is increasing and the quality of those attacks is also increasing. The next question is, what are the biggest uses of AI amongst developers today, and how do you expect that to evolve as we move into 2026? I think amongst developers who are actually employed as developers, the biggest use of AI today is usually around getting things started or tackling complex problems. So a lot of times when you have a very complex or difficult coding or product problem to solve, getting started and having a baseline for how you want to address the problem is usually the most difficult part that takes the most creativity. And a lot of times we'll sit there in front of our keyboards and kind of be like, oh, how am I going to solve this? Where do I even start? So far, I've seen a lot of developers start with generative AI specifically to give a framework. And they don't always just take exactly what's given to them. A lot of times they'll take what a generative AI tool has spit out and use that as the baseline for how they move forward. People who write or do other creative processes do something very similar, where they'll take the initial spit out of whatever it is and then adapt that to what they actually want to accomplish. In 2026, as the new year comes about, what I expect to happen is I expect developers and adversaries to become more sophisticated in the way that they use these tools. So the entirety of this year, I think a lot of developers who have finally gotten access that's been sanctioned by their IT team or their security team, they've been in the stage of like figuring out what's actually possible. What can these tools actually do? Next year, what I think is going to happen is they're going to become more and more sophisticated and skilled at using these generative AI and generated code tools to be able to do even more. So what I expect is that the quality of code that we get out of these developers that are using generative AI, I think that's going to increase. And the sophistication with which they use it will get even better, which I think is a good thing. And as long as we can apply automation and apply the same principles that we use in security and we've been using in software development, as long as we can apply those same principles and levels of automation to this workflow and to the pipeline, I think that will actually put us in a better spot. The last question, the F5 breach and AWS outage showed how fragile dependency can be. How does our reliance on core software providers put us at risk? This is a fun question. I disagree with the premise of the question slightly. So the AWS outage, which was followed by an outage of Azure not long after, and the F5 breach had wide reach. So these few companies had incidents that widely affected the entire internet, the entire body of the internet. And so it was very immediately apparent. It was experienced by everyone, and the news cycle picked it up. Does that mean that those dependencies are riskier to enterprises than trying to handle what F5, AWS, and Azure do on their own? I don't think that that's the case. Where AWS, Azure, GCP, other hosting services providers, and other big companies who provide kind of the backbone of the internet, while a single outage can take down broad swaths of the internet, it's not clear to me that those singular outages or those big news, big headline outages are actually any worse than what an individual company or enterprise would experience if they tried to handle everything that those companies provide by themselves. So let's get specific. Let's say that instead of, my new software company that makes Acme anvils for the cyber world, I decide instead of using AWS that I'm going to build my own data center. I'm going to do all of my own coding for the orchestration and management of scaling, networking, power management, the way that I run my firewalls, the way that I run my in and outs of connections to the internet. Let's say that I decided to do all of those things in-house. Not only would that be prohibitively expensive to me as a new company or as a smaller enterprise, I also will never be as skilled as the workforce and the experience already built into those big players. So I think that the dependency that we place on those big players in the space is actually well placed. I don't think that it's a mistake. What I do think is a mistake would be to experience one of those large outages and not use it as an opportunity to test your resiliency. What did you do when AWS went down or when Azure went down? Did you enact your disaster recovery plan? And did your disaster recovery plan account for a large outage such as those? Even if your entire infrastructure exists on one of those big players that went down, does it include a communications plan? Does it have some way for you to communicate with your customers outside of the bounds of that particular service that went down? And if you found yourself in the middle of that incident and you weren't able to do that, then did you learn from it? And did you take note? Did you find ways and adjust your disaster recovery plan to actually reflect what you would do should an entire region of AWS or an entire, the entirety of Azure goes down? So I think the core software providers do an amazing job, and they do such a good job that when something bad does go wrong, the entire world sits up and takes note. In reality, what happened those days, or what happened in the hours that AWS and Azure were down, a lot of people stood up from their desks, got some coffee, called their friends, and said, "Oh, wow, this is pretty bad." I think that also should have led to some really good conversations about how to recover from incidents like that. Finally, if time permits, which it does, as a field CTO, what human skills still matter most in defending AI-driven development environments? I think that is a great question. And saying something is a great question is the biggest cop-out. I think the question of what human-centered skills matter the most when defending AI-enabled environments or AI-driven development haven't changed at all. I don't think the fact that AI-driven development is the way that development is going in the future changes a lot of what needs to happen with the human-centered skills that engineering teams, field CTOs, security leaders, CISOs, chief security officers. I think that the people skills needed remain the same and are still in demand. I don't think there's enough engineering and security leaders who spend enough time building relationships, personal relationships, not just at the leadership level, but at the practitioner level. I think that security teams and engineering teams at the individual contributor level, the analyst level, the directors, the managers, senior managers, project leaders, project management, program management spaces, all of those people should spend more time understanding each other's work. More engineers should spend and developers should spend more time understanding why security wants them to do things a certain way and helping security design better ways to automate those processes. Just the same way that security leadership and security practitioners should spend time actually figuring out why engineering and developers want to do things a certain way and help assist them to do the things that they want to do in a way that's secure and safer for the enterprise. Personally, I think everybody should have a social worker on board, but I'm biased because I have a degree in social work. And I think it's one of my superpowers is that I understand people and systems in the way that they interact. So thank you for your time. Thank you to the Technado team for this opportunity. And I hope you'll have a wonderful end of the year.